Favorite TMNT episodes, favorite TMNT episodes, favorite TMNT episodes, reviewing every series, Turtle Power. Previously, these are my top 20 favorite episodes of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles franchise. Number 5, Raphael meets his match. Number 4, The Old Switcheroo. Number 3, Splinter No More. Number 2, Turtles on Trial. And finally, number 1, Corporate Raiders from Dimension X. To quote the nostalgia critic, it's stupid, but it's enjoyably stupid. But now, on to things that aren't so stupid, we now get into... 1, 2, 3, 4, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles! Boy, talk about an upgrade! With 7 seasons totaling to 156 episodes, here was the first big makeover the franchise got, all of it for the better. Although this animated adaptation was lightened up significantly from the comics that inspired it, it still takes on a much more serious tone than its 80s predecessor, with the Ninja Turtles creators having much more direct involvement with the show's writing. Much of the faulty, dated writing of the original series was greatly improved upon in this new version. The Turtles still have their iconic personalities, however, each of their characters are much more nuanced and see gradual development as the series progresses. Leo strives to be a good leader and often second-guesses himself when things go wrong. Raph starts off as the classic hit first, ask questions later, but eventually learns how to rein in his more violent tendencies. Mikey always cracks jokes, but gradually starts to take things more seriously, and while Donnie arguably gets the least amount of development, at least his scientific talents are shown more appreciation by the other characters. April O'Neil has also seen an upgrade and is far more brainy and tougher than her 80s counterpart, and her boyfriend Casey Jones is also given a richer, interesting backstory for how and why he became a vigilante. And that's a level of quality that can be said about the entire show in general. The series is great at making everything and everyone important. Things that seem inconsequential at the time have big consequences seasons down the line. Stuff that happens even as early as Season 1 echoes into episodes as late as Season 5, with multi-part stories in a serialized format that makes it nearly impossible to watch episodes at random. You need to watch the show in order for any one episode to make a lick of sense. And for my own personal taste, that's one of the few aspects that I think the 80s show did just a smidgen better. The series seems to have a weird fascination with doing multi-part stories. For some, the extended runtime is needed, but for most others, they tend to drag just a bit, with tons of fight scenes padding out the runtime. It's probably why I preferred the later seasons, as they finally started to move away from this a bit and stuck to one-and-done, one-episode plot lines. Another oddity is the animation itself that took a bit to get used to. The art style takes a heavy anime influence, though I think the split-screen, widescreen effects can get just a bit overused and distracting sometimes, though thankfully they started to move away from this in the later seasons. It can sometimes be hard to keep track of what's going on in a scene when the aspect ratio is constantly changing. Samurai Jack is an example of using split-screen properly when it counts, versus here where it seems they do it mainly just to try and look cool. Though speaking of things that are cool in this show, the more nuanced characterization I mentioned earlier also extends to the secondary cast as well as the villains. Splinter's origin is closer to his comics origin, and I prefer it over the versions where he's a human changed into a rat. Splinter and the Turtles treat each other more like a family than in the 80s version. Shredder is to be feared and isn't a joke anymore, and really none of the wide array of antagonists are to be taken lightly, and each one of them have and or develop some kind of personal connection to our heroes. From Shredder's complicated history with Splinter, to Shredder's daughter Karai constantly questioning her loyalties, to Casey Jones's long-standing grudge with Hun and the Purple Dragons gang, to April's connections to the mad scientist Baxter Stockman, to the obsessed secret government agent Bishop who will stop at nothing to experiment on any alien or mutant he can get his hands on. Nearly every villain is given some kind of backstory, motivation, and character growth to rival the heroes, and more often than not, it's the mutants and monsters who turn out to be the heroes or the friendliest or in need of most help, and humans who are the true villains. Two other random things to note before we get into the episodes here. first is that I kinda wish we get more secondary characters who aren't scientists. Ironic since I usually like brainy characters. Between Donnie, April, the Fugitoid, and Leatherhead, it seems like any new ally that comes along is skilled with sciencey stuff. Casey Jones and Traximus seem to be the only exceptions. I'm not against having a bunch of scientists, but I just wish we had a bigger variety of types of characters, you know? This is partly why I kinda sorta miss April being a news reporter, cause at least then she had a job that was different than the other characters and stood out a bit more than just being Donnie 2.0. I mean, she could still be a budding scientist and computer hacker at the same time, and I do like her personality and toughness better here. I guess what I'm getting at is that when designing a team of characters, you kinda want to each give them some kind of skill that the others can't do. And as much as I like April and her big sisterness, Donnie has all the same technical skills that she does, so it's like having two Donnies in the group. And as great as the Fugitoid and Leatherhead is, I'm like, you guys just made another Donnie. The other big thing of note is that this show isn't shy in depicting character death. Of course there's no blood and it's largely off screen, but you're always reminded, oh yeah, they're ninjas. As in, trained assassins.
Check it out. Laser on overload. Run!
Yeah, those pizza-loving party dude faves of yours, yeah, they're all murderers. Don't let this cute face fool ya, he's a killer.
Yes, I see. I'm afraid the only sensible solution is to blast me into scrap metal right now.
You know, for kids!
Please bear in mind that what few gripes I just mentioned are all just nitpicks at best. While the 80s series is cued for certain tastes, this newer version is something that anyone of any age can get into. And though this series is far more serialized, here's still a quick list of runners-up choices before getting into the nitty-gritty. Honestly, it was much harder for me to pick favorite stories this time around, as there were very few duds in this series. Even episodes that I'd consider to be the worst had at least something noteworthy going on in them, and at no point did I ever feel like my time was wasted. Nonetheless, here are my top 5 favorite stories, beginning with... Number 5, The Tale of Master Yoshi. This first choice comes from the tail end of Season 4, a season that had a bigger variety of stories overall, with an overarching plot about how all the characters were picking up the pieces after Shredder's final big defeat at the end of Season 3. In particular, Leonardo was heavily affected by their near-death experience, and long story short, he strikes out on his own for a bit and goes on a bit of a soul-searching adventure, training for a few months with this old ninja master called the Ancient One. No, not that one. Yeah, that one. Anyway, after Leo gets back from his trip, some more craziness happens that I don't want to totally spoil here. But suffice it to say, after a string of episodes filled with non-stop insanity, we finally get to take a bit of a breather with this one. All the power in the Turtles' lair goes out, so while they're waiting for it to come back on, Leo sits everyone down and recalls a story that the Ancient One told him while he was in training with him in Japan. A story about Splinter's deceased sensei, Hamato Yoshi. One of the biggest strengths of this series was the overall pacing of its storytelling. The writers never saw fit to info dump on the audience. They would always give important information in a piecemeal fashion, revealing certain tidbits here and there, but leaving other things a mystery to keep you watching. Even the full extent of the Turtles' origin story wouldn't be completely pieced together until seasons later. On that same track, every once in a while, Splinter's sensei Master Yoshi would get mentioned, either via tiny flashbacks or through wise advice that Splinter would pass down to his students. But other than that, Yoshi always seemed to be this mysterious, larger-than-life figure that was well revered by everyone who knew him. And yet, we the audience knew little about him. Well, here now, only at the near end of 4 seasons do we finally set the record straight on who this guy was and why Splinter and other ninja masters hold him in such high regard. What we wind up getting is a story of 2 best friends who were like brothers to each other, Yoshi Yoshi and Mishimi, who were trained in the art of ninjutsu by the Ancient One and eventually fell in love with the same girl, a beautiful woman named Tang Shen. But as the years go on and it becomes clear that Yoshi is rising in the ranks of martial arts and that Tang Shen is smitten with him, jealousy begins to seep into Mishimi, and before long the two former best friends become bitter rivals, to the point that Mishimi is willing to sacrifice his honor and loyalty and join the Shredder to get what he wants. This incredibly bittersweet story manages to pull on every emotional heartstring in the span of 22 minutes, getting across so much in just a few short scenes, showing us Yoshi's humble beginnings to how he found Splinter and took him in as a pet, to how he eventually found himself mixed up with aliens and mystical forces and landed in the crosshairs of the Shredder. Much of this is heavily inspired by the story from the original comics, but then again, virtually everything from this show is. I'd like to say more, but this is one time that I don't want to spoil the whole thing. You really just gotta watch it for yourself and see just how important this one man was to so many people, and how much of a tragedy it was when he finally met his end at the hands of the Shredder. Number 4, Worlds Collide. This epic three-parter is easily one of the most exciting and tightly written stories of the entire series, and there's so much going on, so let's not waste time and just get right into the plot. This story actually comes right off the heels of another three-part tale dubbed Space Invaders, in which the alien Triceratons invaded Earth while trying to hunt down this sentient robot dubbed the Fugitoid, although his actual name is Professor Honeycutt. We'll talk more about him in depth in another entry further down the line. Anyway, the Fugitoid, or Honeycutt, or whichever you want to call him, has the plans for a teleportation invention that could turn the tide in an intergalactic war between the Triceratons and the Federation. No, sorry, not that Federation. Anyway, this story picks up right where the Earth invasion left off, with the Turtles doing everything they can to try and protect Professor Honeycutt. And meanwhile, an alien-obsessed government agent named Bishop also gets in on the action, taking advantage of the situation to try and get his hands on all of our main characters so he can dissect them for his research. We'll also talk about him a bit more down the line. Suffice it to say, our heroes got their hands full as they try to contend with hostile aliens and MIB agents, all while having to protect their friend and make sure Honeycutt's scientific knowledge doesn't fall into the wrong hands, or else Earth and the rest of the galaxy could be doomed. Needless to say, there's a lot happening here, but the writers managed to juggle all these crisscrossing plot threads perfectly, and the action doesn't let up for a minute. Professor Honeycutt fast became one of my favorite secondary characters, and after a long absence in the show, I was excited to see him make a return here. I think what I enjoy most about him, besides his intelligence, is the fact that he comes off like such a soft-spoken, nervous dork, but the second anyone he cares about is in trouble, he will not hesitate to throw himself into danger to save people, and he's fully prepared to sacrifice himself to keep the galaxy safe, leading to an ending that I dare not spoil here. Let's just say you better have a tissue box ready. The other major development is that this marks the first real introduction to Bishop, an agent who runs a secret branch of the government that studies and captures aliens. He was sprinkled throughout Season 3 and was then bumped up to main villain status in Season 4 when the Shredder was finally defeated at the end of Season 3. He makes quite the first impression here when he captures the Turtles and is preparing to experiment on them, leading to the entirety of Part 2 involving Splinter, April, and Casey having to mount a rescue mission. From what I can remember, this is probably the only time you ever see Splinter paired up with someone other than the Turtles, and though April and Casey provided plenty of backup from time to time, this was one of the few instances where they were ever truly on their own. It's always a treat to see the main heroes have to be the ones to be rescued for once, and it shows just how much of a difference there is between this April and Casey and their original 80s counterparts. To say any more would give too much away, but in short, this three-part thrill ride is one of the best examples of why this show was such a smash hit when it aired, and why people close to 20 years later still rewatch and look back on this series with such fondness. With top-tier writing and quality characters, it could be watched by kids, but it never talked down to kids, and wasn't afraid to push the boundaries of what a kid show could get away with. And speaking of pushing boundaries, Number 3, Same as It Never Was. Oh man, this episode. As stated before, the 2003 series was never afraid to depict some fairly gruesome stuff, and I gotta give the writers props for finding ways to depict torture and death without any blood or excessive gore. And while this particular story wasn't the first or the last to get pretty dark, it's easily the most depressing and emotional. It's also considered by fans to be arguably the best episode of the show, and I can totally see why. It all begins when a villain, technically two villains, from the Turtles' past shows up to enact revenge against them from an adventure that happened at the tail end of Season 2. I won't get into all the details here, as that would wind up doubling the length of this video. All you gotta know is that this then kicks off a 4-part story arc, and honestly, what episode wasn't part of a story arc by this point? Where each of the Turtles get transported to another reality. Mikey lands in a world full of superheroes, Raph is roped into joining an intergalactic road race, Leo crosses paths with his friend Usagi Yojimbo, and as for Donnie, he gets zapped to, well, hell. Poor Donnie. Everyone else got transported to their ideal dream realities. Why did he have to draw the short straw? Between this and a later episode when he gets mutated into a monster and then accidentally losing Splinter in cyberspace in Season 7, the universe just seems to have it out for Donnie, doesn't it? For those of you who remember the How Long Is Forever episode of Teen Titans, welcome to the Ninja Turtles version of that. Donnie finds himself in an alternate apocalyptic future where the Shredder took over the world, Splinter and Casey are dead, and April leads a tiny resistance movement to little success. And this all came about because at some point in time Donatello disappeared, which caused the rest of the Turtle team to grow apart and break up. Mikey's missing an arm, Raph is missing an eye, and Leo is implied to be blind, though he seems to get around just fine. I don't know, maybe he developed Daredevil's radar sense or something. Anyway, with Donnie now suddenly back in the picture, it's up to him to reunite his brothers and help launch a final assault on the Shredder and hopefully finally save this messed up world for good. I think the real underlying horror of this story is how much of it is left a mystery. We never get the full story of what exactly happened to make this alternate future so bad, and in a certain respect, maybe it's best that we don't find out. Your imagination can just fill in the rest. Even more horrifying is just how much the characters changed, especially Michelangelo. Note to self, a battered and broken, dead serious Mikey is a terrifying Mikey. It's also interesting how Mikey and Raph's general attitudes kind of switched. Now it's Mikey who's permanently angry and Raph who gives Donnie a warm reception. Honestly, you could probably conduct an entire character study for each person with just this one episode. And speaking of characters, up to this point, it seems like Donatello is always the one who fades into the background in terms of popularity in comparison to his brothers. Ask any fan to name off all the Turtles, and more than likely they'll think of Mikey or Raph first, and then probably Leo since he's the leader. But Donnie always seems to be the underrated one, despite him inventing so many amazing things. So despite this being such a dark and unforgiving story, I was really glad to see my favorite turtle finally get the recognition he deserved, and highlight just how incredibly important he is, not just to his team or his family, but to the world at large. Literally, his world would be a sadder, grimmer place without him. Do our heroes manage to save this world? You'll just have to watch and find out. But moving on to a future that isn't so dark, we now get into Number 2, Head of State. You know, how ironic is it that 2003 basically repeated what the 80s series did and did a sudden series format change in its final seasons? After Season 5, this show went in a new direction, altering the art style slightly, lightening up the overall tone, and sending the Turtles and Splinter a century into the future where they meet April and Casey's great-grandson, Cody Jones. Thus begins an entire season where our heroes have to navigate a Star Trek-inspired planet Earth and fight fight all sorts of new bad guys and intergalactic threats, all while trying to find a way back to their own time period. Although this is season 6, most fans and even the title sequence itself refers to this era of the show as the fast forward season, and to say its reception was mixed is a bit of an understatement. It seems you either liked this season or you didn't, and while it had its share of problems, mainly stemming from a potential second season of this plotline getting cancelled, leaving a few plot threads unresolved, I actually really enjoyed Fast Forward. It showed how much of the Turtles' actions affected the world even centuries into the future, one that's very optimistic and bright to the point that mutants and aliens can walk the streets in daylight with zero issues. But how did this all come to pass? Well, to answer that, we have to talk about someone previously mentioned in this countdown, Agent Bishop. As stated earlier, Agent Bishop was a new villain introduced in Season 3 who was then featured more prominently in Season 4. But he's a prime example of a gray area villain who doesn't consider himself to be one. His true intent has always been first and foremost the protection of the Earth from extraterrestrials, even if his methods of accomplishing that goal are questionable. He has a warped sense of logic and moral code driven by a hatred of aliens, obsession with protecting the Earth as if he's the only one who can, and hardening himself to the point where nothing but achieving his goal matters. And as much as we, the audience, detest his methods and xenophobic attitude, you can at least understand his reasoning considering that he himself was abducted and tortured by aliens once. Why am I explaining all this? Well, that's because early into this season, our heroes and the audience get a shock when we find out that in this bright, happy future, Bishop is the president of a galactic alliance and is popular and well-liked by the general public. How is Bishop still alive in this century? Well, I don't want to give away everything. Let's just say this dude is old. Like, really old. How? Again, don't want to spoil too much. You'll just have to watch the show and find out. But anyway, when future Bishop first appeared in the episode Bishop Tonight, I was completely expecting some political intrigue story to happen, where his whole presidency was a front and he actually had some evil scheme going on behind the scenes or something. But no, imagine my total surprise when that didn't happen. This is no joke, people. He really did reform. Why? How? Well, this is the episode that finally gives us some answers when a bunch of mutated monsters start attacking, and it soon becomes clear they're specifically targeting President Bishop. And that's when a nasty skeleton in his closet is revealed. Turns out that back in the day, Bishop and the mad scientist Baxter Stockman were working on some new experiment when a lab accident caused their entire secret base to explode and be destroyed. In the chaos, Stockman was believed to be dead, and though one of the captured aliens could have easily taken revenge on Bishop, they instead showed him mercy and saved his life. This incredible act of kindness finally showed Bishop how wrong he was about what he was doing, and gradually he came to see that to best protect the Earth, it was better to seek out allies with extraterrestrials instead of enemies. But now in the future, Stockman reveals himself to be alive and well, and is out to take his revenge on Bishop for leaving him for dead all those years ago. I absolutely adore this episode, mainly for the top-notch writing and character growth, and for two villains no less. Now obviously Bishop and Stockman's past actions aren't totally absolved or anything, and the dialogue makes it clear that Bishop didn't go through this 180 change overnight. It was a process that took years, and even a century later he's still trying to make up for what he did. But it was just so satisfying to see that this change happened at all, and it was of his own volition. No mind control, no one forcing him into anything, no bribery. He figured out on his own that he had to change, and he of his own will took the steps to make it happen. There's so many shows that have teased at the idea of an antagonist turning over a new leaf. Batman the Animated Series did this quite a few times, but very rarely do they ever fully go through with it. Or if they do, it's typically in some scenario where they wind up sacrificing their lives and dying. So I applaud this episode for giving us a story where two main villains not only see the error of their ways, but heal from the trauma they've been through and use their genius to make the world a better place. Leo's speech to Stockman during the climax summarizes it perfectly, and I won't give it away here. I've probably spoiled enough already. Just go watch it. It's awesome. and frankly is a speech that should be drilled into the heads of every politician. Suffice it to say, this story encapsulates the power of forgiveness and using your talents for the betterment of mankind. You couldn't ask for a happier ending. It's easily the best episode from a very underrated season. If you were put off by Fast Forward in the past, I think you may enjoy it more if you view it as a spin-off to the main series. Give it another chance. I think there's more than a few gems to be found in it. And finally, number 1, Turtles in Space! No, really, it's called Turtles in Space. When else am I going to get a chance to do that joke? Okay, if I'm being brutally honest, Head of State is actually the real number 1, but I'm giving the top spot to this one mainly for just how important it is to the entire show. Much like Corporate Raiders from Dimension X in the 80s series, if you want the full 2003 experience in one go, then this is pretty much it. It's arguably one of the most important episodes of the series, as it introduces a countless number of characters and plot points that will echo far into the show's future. This 5-part epic begins when the Turtles are unexpectedly transported to the other side of the galaxy. How? Why? Those details I won't get into, as it would involve having to sum up a bunch of stuff from Season 1, and it contains quite a bit of spoilers. For the purposes of this discussion, all you gotta know is that the Turtles are now lost in space, and upon their arrival to a strange alien world, they cross paths with the aforementioned Fugitoid, who is on the run from both the Triceratons and the Federation. No, still not that one. Both of which want to capture the android for his knowledge of how to make a matter transporter device that could spell doom for everyone if it fell into the wrong hands. And thus, the Turtles become swept up in the adventure of a lifetime as they hop from planet to planet, making new enemies and allies along the way, all while trying to protect the Fugitoid and find a way back home. Here's yet another storyline taken directly from the original comics, and despite being a whopping 5 parts long, it never drags for a moment. This also serves as our introduction to one of my favorite characters, the Fugitoid, aka Professor Honeycutt, who we also find out was once human, but then his consciousness accidentally became fused with his service android. Yeah, it's weird sci-fi nonsense, just roll with it. I already talked a bit about why I like him so much in the Worlds Collide section, so I won't repeat myself here, but bottom line, he's the perfect example of how you take a nerdy, nervous, bumbling, clumsy character and make them likable and endearing and not annoying. This is also our introduction to the Triceratons, who are basically like the TMNT answer to the Klingons from Star Trek, but even this early on, the writing is careful to not paint them as being completely evil. On the contrary, one noteworthy Triceraton is this gentleman named Traximus, who has become disheartened with how far off the honor-led path his people have gone, and seeks to somehow bring peace to his people again. There is just so much that happens in this one story alone, I would probably have to make a separate video just to cover it all. It's packed to the brim with exciting chases, escape from Alcatraz-level prison riots, gladiatorial cage matches, hilarious undercover disguise shenanigans, space battles. This story has everything, and most importantly, the Turtles' actions from disrupting the Federation Triceraton War to befriending Traximus to helping the Fugitoid. Everything they do has long-reaching consequences that forever change the course of the show, both big and small, both for good and for bad. Anyone who wants to write for TV should watch this string of episodes, and by extension this entire show, to see a perfect example of how you properly write dramatic, engaging, likable, and proactive characters. It's no wonder this incarnation of the Turtles has garnered so many fans and continues to hold up to this day. Overall, this show is everything that a really good action-adventure comedy series should be. If you enjoyed the original series from the 80s, then this remake takes the best aspects of that show, combines it with plot lines from the comics, and elevates everything to a mature standard that both kids and adults will appreciate. If you enjoy Batman the Animated Series or Disney's Gargoyles, you'll love this. But as good as it was, we must now move on to the next attempt at a franchise reboot.
Heroes in the half shell, turtle power,